would like to complete what has been a tremendous morning of great engagement, participation, stimulating discussion with a fantastic keynote speaker. And our keynote speaker this afternoon is Jim McQueeny. He is no stranger to many of you and has been involved in New Jersey politics and media for many, many years. Most recently, he took his leave from Channel 9, the Sunday talk show, to answer the call of his friend, Phil Murphy, to be senior counsel to his successful campaign for governor. Today, he continues to be an advisor to the transition team as well as governor-elect. Jim has served as Chief of Staff to U.S. Senator Frank Lautenberg, Communications Director of the General Assembly and the State House, and White House Bureau Chief for the Star-Ledger. He shared in the award of the Pulitzer Prize to the Star-Ledger for his op-ed on the resignation of Governor Jim McGreevey. He frequently appears on network TV news shows discussing political issues, and his writings have been published in the Washington Post and the New York Times, among other national publications. His communications company, Winning Strategies, is award-winning, in fact. In fact, he probably represents many of you, as I know he does, and he's been a true friend to us for a long time at NJBIA. Please welcome Jim McQueeny.
Welcome, everybody, and I know that we're going to take a few minutes to talk about basically the backstory of this election, which really might not have made a lot of the newspapers or the television stories on it, and it might be maybe providing some insight to the way people, well, not only the mood of people on how they elect their leaders, but also the mood of people who are probably your customers and the like. But before we talk about the most powerful governor's office in the country, and New Jersey's governor's office is that, because in 1947, things were so bad with the legislature running amok, or maybe it's still running amok, but in the 40s, it running amok, and the reformists wanted to sort of put them in check. So they recreated the position of governor to make it the most powerful position in the country, actually, at the time, and it's still pretty much the case now. So, but despite that, how powerful it is and how much of an influence it really does have, and we'll talk a little about that it may have as well going forward. I always like to tell people to keep the issue of power in New Jersey politics in perspective. And by that I mean, where does power, political power in New Jersey really lie? You might think governor from what I just said, constitutionally and the like, but I like the story of Congressman Hughes, former Congressman, Watergate baby down Atlantic County, and he won a surprise election, of course, to Congress, and he decided to come back and hold his town meeting at the high school he went to near Atlantic City. So he's behind a table, the green felt table, and there's an auditorium full of people, and he's real happy. He opens up and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, so happy to be here. My town meeting, congressional thing. I'd like to hear your issues, blah, blah, blah." And an elderly lady at the front of the microphone with the first question, when he goes, "So, ma'am, please start our official town meeting." And she leans forward and she goes, "Congressman, what are you going to do about all those dogs running around town, crapping on the lawns, peeing on the hydrants, and eating the garbage? And would you please be specific?" So the congressman leans forward and just says, "Ma'am, I'm a congressman. I deal with treaties, international law, a lot of domestic things like this in the national economy. Perhaps you should really address that question to your mayor." And nonplussed, she leaned back into the microphone and said, "Mayor? Frankly, Congressman, I didn't want to start that high first." So whenever we talk about politics in New Jersey, whenever we've had to practice it and the like, it's good to always remember where the really power is perceived to be by people. And then just one quick thing, the frustration of when you're in elective politics now, everybody wants everything from a politician or elected official, and the requests are many and the anger is very high. And I'll get into that in a little bit here when we talk about the election dynamics. I like another story that's like this that talks about this frustration of politicians. I had a person I met. He was a councilman in Morristown. This was many years ago. And he was also an usher at a Catholic church in Morristown. And there was this elderly couple who went to the same Mass that he was being an usher for at 8 o'clock Mass. And they would come up, and they knew he was on council, and they'd say to him, he had a district or a ward that they were in, and would say to him, listen, what are you going to do about paving our road? It's horrible. Hubcaps fall off, all this stuff, blah, blah, big danger, big danger. Well, this guy was in the minority party in his town at the time, and he really could do nothing. The majority party just said, why should we help a guy in that ward who's not our guy, all right? So the fact of politics. So every 8 o'clock Mass for about 2 years, this happened. They'd come out of their car, they'd walk real mad, they'd come up the steps and they would yell at him, what are you going to do about our road, paving our road? And finally his party gets in power. Finally he can do something about it. He gets the road paved. He waits at the steps, the stairs, at the church for them to come for the 8 o'clock Mass. And there they come. And the first sign that there's something wrong was that they still had that angry walk from the parking lot to the steps. And they come up, they look at him, and he's expecting all the praise for 2 years of abuse. And they say, what are you going to do about all those cars speeding down our newly paved road? So, look, when we talk about expectations of politicians and the like, just sort of keep in mind where the power might be in New Jersey and also what the unmet expectations and met expectations can really do as well. So, for a little bit of the election backstory here, again, perhaps something a little more than what you read in the newspapers and the like. Phil Murphy, first of all, a stranger to New Jersey politics for sure. You've probably seen enough of the commercials and the like to think you know who Phil Murphy is. But I first met Phil Murphy about 15 years ago, introduced by Frank Lautenberg, who, as Michelle said, I was the former chief of staff to Frank Lautenberg. And Frank said to me at the time, why don't you talk with Phil? He's a guy the kind of person we really need in politics, whether it be national or whether it be here. So we stayed very close. And about 4 years ago, I was in Berlin on some business, and he was the ambassador there. I stopped and had lunch with him, and we talked New Jersey politics. And Christie was on the way to a rout at that point in time. And he said, well, what happens after Christie gets reelected? And I said, it's a wide open field at that point in time. And we talked a little more, and at that point in time, on that lunch at the embassy overlooking the Brandenburg Gate, he said, well, if I wanted to get involved, what would I have to do? I recommended he do a 501c3, do public policy issues and the like, and decided right there, he says, well, I'll do that because I want to come home and I really want to help New Jersey and find out what the issues are that are either being neglected or just need to be introduced. I got a lot of energy, and him and Tammy have a lot of energy. Some of you have probably met the both of them, right? And so I ended up heading up his think tank called New Start New Jersey, and that's what we did for 2 years until he announced in the spring, last year, early summer, announced very early. And I have to say that this election, and I've coursed through many of them, 11 of these elections, from being a cub reporter, 20 years old, when Brendan Byrne came in, and that was for the Star Ledger, the first one I covered every administration. Since then, probably coursed my way through them as a journalist or in politics and what have you. This was perhaps, apart from the Kane 85 election and the Christie last election, perhaps one of the most oddest elections that I've ever seen. Why? From the primary day in June to Labor Day to Columbus Day to Election Day, Phil Murphy was tracking at 15 points ahead. Always. It dipped a point, it rose a point, it dipped a point. Usually in every gubernatorial election, you see the lines cross. You see them come fairly close to Labor Day, and Columbus Day is at the midway point or the critical point that where you are dictates where you're going to spend the rest of your money for campaigning, and that's when the race gets real, basically around Columbus Day. It gets introduced. And this was really, really strange because I had never seen a frozen rope like this. Murphy was on top like this, Guadagno was on the bottom, 15 point, from the very beginning, 15 points. So, one of the things we did along the way was track why this bulge and why the reason, and why does someone come for the first time in a long time that I've ever seen outside of those two races with a bulge that began and ended the same way. Okay, well, one of the things you do is tracking, which many of you know in politics. It's a little different than polling. It's a little quicker, and it's retrieval, and it goes weekly if you need to do tracking. It's not like the big polls of which you do 2 or 3 or 4 in the course of a campaign. These are like taking the temperature along the way. So the tracking polls also have the equivalent of word clouds now. You know, when you see an analysis of issues, they show the big word clouds are the most mentioned words and the most fears, and then you go the less and less and less, right? Word clouds. If you were to put the word clouds to the statistics on this election about the 15-point bulge and why it was there, why it was there mostly and why it stayed that way, the polling word cloud would, the biggest cloud was a cloud called change. And it was a neutral cloud, meaning it was just a white cloud. It meant that there wasn't a lot of emotion. It's just the idea people wanted change. And that cloud was the biggest cloud of all the word clouds going down. The next one after that was the Christie cloud. And that was very dark, and that meant it was very emotional and very intense. And that word cloud that said Chris Christie also had a word with it, and the word was dislike. That was the most frequent word that was used. And by the way, Tracking All the Way had that the same way, except in the summer during the beach episode where the bottom really came out for Guadagno to recover from that word cloud. And then after that was a Trump cloud, but interestingly, it wasn't as dark as you might think the Christie cloud was, right? It was just a hardcore belief about fundamental republicanism or fundamental America, make America great. And there's a lot of pockets of that feeling in New Jersey as well. So you had that. And then you came to the two candidates, and nobody really knew who the two candidates were. They really didn't know who Kim Guadagno was, and they really didn't know who Phil Murphy was. So with that modest description of what this election was during the whole year, you can see it's almost, I mean, I could be cruel and say as a former journalist, the choice was to most voters along the way between Tweedledee and Tweedledum. It just had to be someone who would represent change, someone who wasn't Chris Christie, someone who wasn't Donald Trump, more of an influencer than a decisive thing, and then someone who would align with the big issues on what they thought beyond the personalities involved. And so let me just tell you on the issues for a second, it might surprise you, and the issues that were driving this, it really might surprise you. The biggest single issue on all the polling, and I don't think the Republican polling was that much different, the biggest single issue was, I'm putting numbers on here, the average numbers through this thing. The biggest issue in this campaign was actually, apart from those word cloud issues of personality, was corruption and government distrust. A little bit of a carryover from the presidential, right? That was a lot of what was in there. But corruption, 33%. Had that issue they wanted to resolve by who they would choose for governor. The second one was property taxes. Property taxes were close behind it at about 29%. And then the issue number 3 was health care. Losing it, even employers concerned about this on health care, how they, as an expense item or a care item to employees and the like, right? And then the number 4 issue was immigration. Surprisingly enough, even for a progressive state like New Jersey. I meant to say also property taxes 29%, health care was 20%, and immigration was 10%. Now, when candidates see these numbers, apart from that word cloud that suggests the general environment and sentiment of voters, they have to fashion their campaign commercials, which are still the things that make them known in New Jersey. New Jersey is an incredibly difficult state to communicate in. We really only have the 2 senators and the governor as statewide people who run. So there's not a lot like in states like Texas, they might have a dozen people who run statewide office and get name recognition and the like. It's really hard between the first and fourth media market to really get known because both media markets are different. And it's not surprising that a lot of people run for governor and fail before they become governor because that's how hard it is to get name recognition when you want to run as a candidate. So the campaign strategy for both camps was, remember that poll I said, corruption and government distrust as the biggest thing. Remember that word cloud that I said was change. So that huge word cloud and the specific issue of corruption, everybody probably remembers the Phil Murphy campaign ads and where those ads were shot, right? Nearly every one of them were shot with the visual of the George Washington Bridge behind him. And of course that's no accident. That touches the number one issue for Murphy at the time, the tactical issue. And also in that, he said, of course, I've got your back, which means I'm connected to you. And it showed the bridge, which told everybody Bridgegate and beach chair. That was the shorthand in the conversation during the campaign among the campaign people. Now, when you saw Kim Guadagno, what could she do? She had a very difficult task to unwind herself from Chris Christie, was his partner for 8 years, but it's not impossible to do something like that. So the number two issue is what I told you was property taxes, right? So she seized, because she couldn't do the number one issue, that was owned by Phil Murphy. So she went to the number two issue, which was very close to the number one issue, and that was property taxes. And the property tax ads, you would have thought really did reflect the sentiment of voters out there, and it's a dangerous sentiment. It's a financial thing. But she went and did the first campaigns on property taxes, if you remember her spots. And I think those commercials were very good. And I know the Murphy people were a little concerned when they first saw them, because again, money and taxes in New Jersey, as your own survey has shown on the Outlook thing, are really big concerns by people. It's a life and death issue. It's a limiting issue, and especially with the middle class, which is what she had to contest for with Phil Murphy. So she did property taxes first, and they were good commercials, but they didn't do anything. They didn't narrow that 15% lead gap. And even we were wondering, well, why not? And later on in some of that tracking, we found that people are so hardened to property taxes not being fixed, they move on to the next issue that concerns them, whether it was that big issue about government competence or corruption, or whether it was some of the other issues we do. So what you saw was she could not go to the next issue. She couldn't default from property taxes, which wasn't working, to health care. She couldn't go to health care because the Republican Party was dismantling Obamacare. So what was she really going to say that would counter her base voters and independent voters, which really dominate this election, right? She had to go to that next category that I said here on tracking, which was immigration. She also wanted to seize and capitalize on the fact that Phil, if you might recall, said during an interview on television, it was televised, that he would go beyond sanctuary cities, he would go to sanctuary state. So they took that issue, immigration, and his faux pas, well, he's not saying it's a faux pas, but you prefer he wouldn't have said that in the campaign at the time. And that was, they thought, in some degree we were worried, that she could make up that and start getting traction in this election at the very end, even at the very end, because she really only used the immigration issue, or sanctuary, right, at the very end. Again, it wasn't a bad spot. It did have tones of Willie Horton and the like, which was ridiculed in the press, and this spot, too, was ridiculed a great deal in the press, and also the religious community came up. And it brought with them, it hurt her because a lot of the religious community was speaking about Latins and Catholics, and that's not the way they feel about immigration or sanctuary, and she had an Hispanic running as her ticket mate. So how that was going to work, we weren't sure, but it didn't work. And the polling, again, just to go over this, we're 15 points almost at every polling junction. Property taxes didn't even dent that. Immigration, which again we thought was going to be hard, did dent that. It dented it about 1.5 points from the 15, but you worry when there's a little chip on your lead, can you get in and make a bigger hole on that thing? So for about 5 days, the campaign was a little concerned that we may have miscalculated the effect of what sanctuary cities really meant to most people in New Jersey. Tracking data showed it had only dented it 1 point. And then 1 week later, with all the outcry and about the type of spots that were run. 1 week later, it went back to 15, and it stayed at 15 again, right to the very end, or 14, to the very end in that election. So you see the tactics, how you adjusted the issues and what the environment was and what the backstory was. There's also an innate advantage by Democrats in the state of New Jersey. They tend to skew Democratic, but not always. Obviously, they've elected Republican governors, the present one included here, and by mandates that remain, with Tom Kean in '85, the biggest ever mandate, and then a huge mandate the last time, only 4 years ago, right? So there's room for Republican thought and candidates here. But there's 800,000 more registered Democrats in New Jersey than there are Republicans. And it's also good to know the wild card factor is independent voters or unaffiliated voters are the majority of voters in New Jersey. It's more than 50%. Democrats are about roughly 27%, and Republicans are about 20% in that run. So when we talk about New Jersey being a swing state and open for change, which you've seen by governors Republican and Democratic, that's pretty much why, because of the voting sentiment and voter registration. One of the other interesting things before we move out of the backstory of this campaign was the amount of money, about $35 million with all the independent expenditures brought in, and even with the lowered expenditures in the general, because of matching funds, lower the amount that the candidates individually can spend. But for both parties, a lot of independent expenditures come in, and it's a lot of money. The total amount they spent to become governor, the two parties and all the IEs, were about $35 million. $35 million. Now, you look at the $35 million spent, I do, you look at the 15 points before the money was spent, and you see the 14 points that ended, and you see the lowest voter turnout, and you really got to ask, what does campaign money do anymore, right? I mean, so that's one of the anomalies that's going on and going forward as it relates to campaigns in New Jersey, whether they be gubernatorial or whether they become the next legislative races. And of course, we all saw in the McWeeny race down there, the amount of money, almost as much or half as much, was put into a legislative race, made it the most expensive legislative race in the country when the NJA wanted to depose Sweeney or teach him a lesson or whatever logic that was used in there, which defies me. When we talk a little bit about maybe what's ahead right now, Phil had, every candidate has to live with campaign promises or ignore them. Phil had a lot of campaign promises because Phil is a progressive, whether you call him a Democrat or whatever, but it was a progressive. And progressives come with a lot of ideas to do more things. Usually more things require more money. So you're coming into an administration with campaign promises, and there were many. I'll go through them in a second here, how you reconcile them. But you're also running into a governor who's right now, and I'm a little bit of the part of this here as on the transition stuff, looking to get people to serve into government at frozen salaries, and everybody says, oh, you get big cushy jobs and stuff. Well, they kind of forget when you're professional administrators in government servants, I always like that word actually, government servants rather than bureaucrats, because they really do hard work and they really are a buffer for either competition or fairness and what have you. So 8 years with Democrats out. 8 years is an interesting thing when Democrats are out and you look for the usual suspects to sort of help the staff and administration. Many of those people are now 8 years into careers in the private sector. Private sector generally pays more. It's frankly more rewarding. Government service often really is a service, and I don't mean to apologize for it or over-glorify it, but it is hard work when you work in the government. It's rarely respected, but it's needed. And then now in transition, when you look to come after 8 years, it's not that you're looking for Democrats to bring them back from exile. You're really looking for competence that reflect your philosophy. There's not, and Phil's not this kind of guy, by the way. He's a guy who looks for competence and excellence in what you do. And he's shown a streak in the 15 years I've known him, and in the last 4 years running his nonprofit. Anybody's ideas that really work, come on in, let's make them try. Let's try them out. We did many of those with New Start New Jersey, a lot of them on here, and new things he wants to try. I know on going forward, this transition thing, and the critical, of course, is picking cabinet heads, because the cabinet heads get their say on who fills their departments. And also, so I think you're going to be seeing here very shortly, on a little bit of an expedited basis, probably the cabinet picks. I'm thinking Attorney General might actually come first. That's sort of the tent pole of everything. The reflection of an administration, having a strong Attorney General is very important. One could argue that any governor in New Jersey, and I'm not meaning anything by this statement, I'm just telling a political reality, it's real good when you're governor to have a strong Attorney General. Why? Because there are many times you're sitting with legislative leaders of your own party and you think you can get this all through, and nobody has a cause for pause to say, but what would the Attorney General think about this? And if it's not a respected Attorney General, they go ahead and they end up being in a place where you don't want to be. If it's a respected Attorney General, it's a cause for pause, and you get it right. And it's often an excuse for the governor to say, let's see what the Attorney General says first, rather than end up in court later. And so many of these issues over the years have now been entangled in the courts, where I can tell you, education issues, pension issues, blah, blah, blah. Well, I think by having a strong Attorney General and also thinking ahead of that so you don't end up there is a goal of this administration as well. So those cabinet selections you're going to start to see rolling out probably in the next 2 weeks or 3. Maybe Secretary of State, because it may have an economic agenda that's going to be heightened a little bit more. And AG, that would be my guess. It's not my knowledge. But that's pretty much where that'd be. And the real philosophy of where the rubber hits the road, on where change can start, the transition committees, the Gang of 500, I like to call it, that was in this. A decision was made to make this an inclusive group. You could have made it an exclusive group, smaller, more focused, and make it work with real reports that end up being documents that the new people who come in, the head departments, use. In this case here, there was a decision to sort of say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, as chaotic as it might seem. It's better to have everybody in with their early thoughts. And that's why you see all this discussion and all these picks about 500 some odd people, which is probably twice the size it probably would have needed to be, maybe 3 times the size it needed to be. But that was the decision to be inclusive. So their reports will be submitted to the administration at the end, the last week of December, and there'll be an evaluation. Also going on contemporaneously now is a working group in its nascent stage about what the first 6 months are for the new governor. And remember, the new governor inherits a budget that's not his for the first part of his term. It's sort of like an ignominious thing. You have to take the budget of the person you beat. You have to take the budget of an administration that you said was incompetent, or whatever languages you use. But you are stuck with that budget, by and large, for this year going forward. It's really not your budget. You can tweak parts of it, but you can't tweak all of it. It's $35 billion. It's set in cement, pretty much set in cement. And it takes a big issue to really change that. So you have to defend that budget. You have to put that through with your party leaders in both houses going forward. And you're going to end up with something at the last day of June that you're not going to really be happy with, and probably because it's going to have to involve significant cuts. And without matching revenue items, it's going to be hard to add more money to it. And to go back now with this as the reality to the campaign promises, the campaign promises were many, and for a progressive, it was about better education funding. It was protecting the integrity of the pension fund. It was $15 an hour minimum wage, which your report yesterday and your membership said they don't like that. There are a lot of things which you'll recall that were promised. Now, in a campaign, most things that are promised sort of somehow find their way. What you said was yes and possible when you're running for office, you tend to find out when you're governing it's no and barely possible, because there's a price tag to it that's real, as opposed to a promise and a budget estimate that's not real when you campaign for everybody. And this candidate and this governor-elect included, I think. But I think you'll find that Phil is quite literal. From what he's said in the times we've been together here in the last few weeks, I think he is going to move to really redeem those promises at the front end of the administration. I think you'll see some things very quickly after January 16th that are attached to those campaign promises. Like I said, the difficulty is this isn't your budget. Your budget is the next year. And that's the one you're going to start to be judged on. But you still have to defend this one. Now, the other issue is about who you talk to and who you deal with when you make this budget. And there's a lot of research that goes into this. Phil will have another think tank that will actually look a little more into this. He's a think tank guy. That doesn't make him having the disease of analysis paralysis. He's not like that, very decisive. But he likes out-of-the-box things, and this is an administration he's acknowledged. While he's told people in the campaign, I have your back, he really has to say to them when he governs, we can't go back. We can't go back and find the solutions. So many of the things that have powered government for 40 years now probably no longer apply. The state has overborrowed, it's overspent. It has an environment in the tax world, residential world and voter world that says too much taxation. And the Trump tax reform comes on the top of this. Now, Phil had talked a great deal about the millionaire's tax, and that is still something that he's still talking about and believes. That's $1.3 billion roughly on a $35 billion budget, right? And then Trump comes along with a tax reform, takes away two of the biggest deductions for a high tax state like us, and now the legislative leaders, Democratic legislators now asking that there be some pause in this. Let's take a look. And there are things you got to look at. So without even getting into office, he's being impacted, the new governor, from what he might be able to do, might not be able to do by things that are happening in Washington. You have tomorrow, the governor is going to have a press conference announcing the final report on the pension reform by the Pension Commission. This is going to be an ugly story that's going to be at the doorstep of the Democrats and Phil Murphy. And this one's also going to show that the bipartisan agreement to use the lottery money to sort of slow down this rising debt and unfunded liability is going to be shown to have barely done anything at all, despite everybody feeling it was the greatest thing you could do to fix it. Doesn't work. That will tell you, by the way, how bad that problem is. And it will also tell you there is no easy answers to do it. And the real coming to Jesus is going to be after tomorrow about that pension. And it may have to be front-ended in this administration as well by what you want to do. I guess the way out that you could find when you came into government before, Republican and Democratic, it was sort of a given that when you came in with this bad budget that's not yours, what you did the first year is you punted the ball. How'd you punt the ball? You generally borrowed where you could, where it's not seen as much, and you blamed the predecessor to put more taxes in, and you basically played to tie the first year to do no more harm to yourself politically or financially to the state. Every incoming first year has been pretty much like that. This is a case where, as I said before, there's no room to borrow. There's no mood to tax. So this administration is probably going into something that's unprecedented, and it really is unprecedented. And by the way, you can't blame the predecessor for this one, especially the pension. Democrats and Republicans were in total cahoots with each other over 2 decades to let that thing balloon to where it would go. Irresponsible, both parties. But now it's got to be fixed for reasons I said before. This fourth and final report is going to be very dramatic tomorrow, and it's probably going to have to put this to the front of the agenda. Now, what does that also mean? It means some of the biggest cost items are going to be put in place for the first year, cost items, that may squeeze out other things that others want to do. So he needs to listen to what the professional people, financial people, are going to say that you need to do, even if you've inherited. Tough. You got to fix it. Probably have to fix it early because it's that bad. The way out, the typical way out, exists no more. So in some ways, if this administration wanted to get by the first year in the typical way out till you got to your year, year 2, year 3, year 4, that may be taken away from Phil Murphy in this administration. So a lot is going into new ideas. There's probably going to be things like P3, public-private partnerships studied to an unprecedented degree. The business alliances are going to be really critical. I mean, it's one of the sad things in politics, and I've seen it over 40 years. You bring in business to consult when it's really bad, and that's usually a sign it's really bad, but it's really bad. That can be an opportunity as well, where the voice of business can be heard more because you're more desperate to hear it. I would view that as really an opportunity for business that exists now, that probably got lip service in the past, But it also means you got to come up with ideas, and you got to come up with ways that are financially related to those ideals, and still kind of avoid taxation because of that mood environment I said before. But a lot of these things involve partnerships. And I think there'll be an unprecedented view both in the research toward partnerships and the policies toward partnerships and the decision to do them very quickly as well. As I said before, I can't give the sequence of things that will be taken in the sequence they'll be taken. Just look at the campaign promises. I think in general you'll see he will adhere to that more quickly than other governors really do. Whether he can do it or he can't, I think with Phil you'll get a yes, no, up, down, left, right. That's the way he is. Move on. And I think you want that as a governor directing a legislature, but there's not a lot to work with, and that's the simple truth about the way it is coming into this administration. I will say just before, I think we have some questions that are going to occur to this. Probably the questions are more relevant to what I could guess at what you want to do, but Phil will come into an administration with it. He won't have what I call the Barney Doyle excuse. There are a few people in the room who I know this story, but when a guy named Barney Doyle in Hudson County was put in charge of Department of Weights and Measures by the bosses there. This is the old days. We'll say Hudson's cleaned up now, but okay. So in the old days. So Barney Doyle goes to his first press conference to really set the signal for how he wants his administration to be as the head of Weights and Measures. The first question asked of Barney Doyle was, skeptically by the reporter, "Hey, Barney, how many ounces in a pound?" And he answered, "Come on, guys, I'm just starting the job." So Phil isn't going to have an excuse to blame his predecessor, not for long. He's inheriting that budget that you need to work with, which is not much to work with. You don't have an exit ramp that other governors had in their first year of borrowing and taxing. This is, I would say, from at least my term, going back to Brendan Byrne, January '74, an unprecedented moment in New Jersey's, for a New Jersey governor, and probably for state government as a whole. And of course, state government as a whole rolls all the way back to local governments. I have to tell you, county and local governments. So I think we're in for a tough haul. There's a lot of optimism. Even your business survey showed that in your business evaluations here, that optimism really did reign the day, with a lot of concerns for a lot of specific things that need attention. But I think Phil is bringing the optimism. You saw the energy. I like to say when Atlantic City, I talked to him after he did that hop going to the podium, and I said, "What was that about?" And then he said, "Jim, we all know Irish, and my family's Boston Irish as well, right?" He said, "We all know what the Irish exit is, and if anybody doesn't know what it is, the Irish exit is Irish guys always leave a room and never say goodbye. Superstition, right? They always leave the room." And so he says, "That was my Irish entrance." I said, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "I did the hop because I did a jig, but nobody recognized it was the Irish jig. It was stunted." And then so I know the Irish exit and I know the Irish entrance. And both of those actually are about optimism, the Irish entrance here. So I think Phil really has this optimism. He has the creativity. He has a legislature of his own party, good and bad, in this case. So the engine has to pull out, and the ideas are going to be flowing, and the people to staff it and carry out, and people that you'll be intersecting with, a matter of a few weeks. So with that somewhat optimistic but explanatory thing, but the reality is not so great financially for the state. Any questions? And there's a mic here, or someone walking around with the mic here. Any questions?
How do you do? I'm Bart Jackson. You mentioned one thing about back when in the running of the race, and it was a 15% pretty much straight through. And then you also mentioned that it was the low voter turnout. The media, it seems to me, has done an exquisite job of keeping the horse race, in our view, even more than the issues very often. And is that part of are we really caught up in the horse race? Is that part of when you plan the campaign? I know it's sort of a side issue, but I'm curious. Is the horse race and the leads and the polls and so forth, is that something that you're shooting when you're developing a campaign to keep ever in front or not?
Could you just say the last part of that sentence? Because we don't have mics up here. I don't have loudspeakers up here. What was the last part of that sentence? I heard the preamble, but Were you asking about the media's relationship to the horse race aspect of the campaigns?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was saying that that you have a low voter turnout and you have an absolute steady belief that the 15% candidate is going to win. Is that sort of a standard? Is that what brings out the low voter turnout? Is that, I mean, didn't everyone feel that from the beginning or not?
It's a really good question. It touches a few things. It touches the politicians themselves, cynicism toward them, but it introduces the media element, if you will, right? The power of the media has really changed in New Jersey, and I'm very familiar with it, having worked for the Star-Ledger for 10 years. I was the State House Bureau Chief and the White House Bureau Chief, and then I went to Television News 12, where I had a talk show for 10 years, and then to Fox-owned Channel 9, where I did this, right? So I've never really left media, even though I've run businesses and run campaigns and stuff like that. And I have seen the change of media. It's a harmful change in one big way, and it's somewhat okay on another level. The media interest in media numbers and media expertise is actually terrible. I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I had to participate in an event for a client which happened to be PSE&G, and they had a hearing that attended 100 people. It's a big hearing about the fate of the nuclear plants in New Jersey. And so I walked over with Ralph Izzo before his testimony, and I was telling him a strategy of how to deal with the gaggle of reporters. That's the phrase for a lot of reporters, right? A gaggle of reporters. And how at the end of your testimony is where they really get you or get what they want. And you make most of your mistakes right there with the gaggle of reporters, not the testimony that you give. That's sort of straight, and your answers that you give are straight. So we walked over, and I had to look for the reporters. There were 3 reporters covering this important hearing about all energy. It just wasn't about the nukes. It was about all energy in New Jersey. That's a pretty important thing with a lot of economic consequences all down the line. It's a big deal. And the committee was there and everyone was there. 3 reporters covering this hearing. And I was walking back with Ralph, and he too was struck by this. And by the way, there was no story in the Star-Ledger today about this important hearing, just as an aside. And I was walking back across the street with him, and he said, "Where's the gaggle?" And I said, "I think it's lost in the decades, because when I was here at the State House, this kind of story would have been covered by 20 reporters." And I'm not exaggerating. We had 50 reporters in the 70s and 80s covering the State House. 50. I have a picture of all of them in my office at the heyday of this. And now a handful cover the State House. So the paucity of information about things that are important, let's call state government important, politics, statewide elections important, it really doesn't get covered. And here's another bad thing about the media right now. And I'm going to say it about my alma mater, the Ledger, but the Ledger is no different than, say, Gannett, which has now become the biggest chain in New Jersey. I imagine people know what a trending board is in newsrooms and the like. The trending board is up there at the top of the wall, and it says what stories are trending, social media and the like, or any media, trending stories. If you want to write a story about Ajax cleanser, and Kleenex is the big story running up there, you want to find a way to connect your story to Kleenex. Why? You will get heightened engagement numbers to your story. Now, you might think that's a good thing, heightened engagement numbers. It means people and readers interact with what you do. It's not a good thing for this reason. Funny cats who jump on furniture and stuff like that and are like the biggest engagement things that make people do it. People falling off of skateboards and blah, blah, blah. Those are the things that really make people look at it. I'm sorry to say, yeah, they do. And those stir the most engagement. Things like covering state government or government as a whole or politics are the last thing that stimulate engagement. Oh, you might think because you see on Fox a lot of colloquy, extreme things and polarization, all that stuff. That's in that world. The world that you and I and the rest of us live, that's not in this world. And the people don't want to read this stuff, don't want to see it, and they go past it, even if they use their devices to look at it, or something that's not, as I say, papyrus, a newspaper on here. So what you see are reporters who are now trained to go away from stories that are important because they're not read and not engaged. And by the way, it's not because they want to do that. Their compensation is dictated, a great deal of it, on how much engagement they got for the paper they're writing for, because the engagement numbers sell advertising. Just like it used to be in the old days, newspaper circulation sold advertising. Now the engagement numbers, because there's not really circulation anymore and online. So they write that which is going to give them raises at the end of the year. And you can see in November and December why the stories get goofier and goofier, because they have to sit down with their engagement numbers, with their editors, and close the gap in their pay and get a pay raise for next year. It's unbelievable. And this is all media by and large. And there was a woman from CNN when I was out covering a convention last year, and she said to me, she'd been in the business a long time. In fact, she started a business here in New Jersey as a reporter. And she said to me, we're not in journalism anymore. We're in churnalism. We just churn crap all day long to chase the trending board to get our money. That's the shocking thing. So when it comes, I'm sorry about that, I was doing a little diatribe on that, but as it relates to politics, it relates very big to politics. First of all, nobody really wants to follow you, and it's mood that runs things more than ever than facts. And you saw when newspapers would try to catch politicians with fact check, all this stuff. That became one of the least read things. You don't see fact check anymore. They got rid of it. Was it good probably for journalism and good for civic discourse? Absolutely. It absolutely was. Is it there now? Hardly. Why? Because nobody read it and it took up space. They could put in a click to a video link of a leaping cat that smiles. I'm sorry. It's engagement numbers. That's what they do. So it's real hard. And covering the campaign, last thought about that, sort of follow your question. It used to be you'd have to get a bus to cover campaigns. When I covered Brendan Byrne, a campaign, 70s, right? They got a bus. The bus was full of reporters like me. The bus was trailed by TV vans. We would go out, especially from the home stretch, Columbus Day to Election Day, about a 3-week period. We would go out every single day to multiple events, and they weren't as staged as they could be now and as they are now. Today you do like one event that the media, it's open to the media for. It's all contrived by both parties because everybody wants control. Why? Because the media doesn't quite matter in the elections for elections period unless you fumble the ball. You fumble the ball, and that's an opportunity, right? Because the media jumps on it. Social media drives it, all this stuff. And it's a big problem then, right? So politicians of both parties find a nice little thing they can do for the middle of the day that makes that feeds the beast. Feeds the online, feeds the bloggers, feeds the TV that runs every hour now because it's not a 24-hour deadline anymore to make the next newscast. It's something else now. So you feed the beast every day. There is no bus anymore. I can tell you from the last campaign. You're lucky if 3 people show up, even in the last day, for an event, and they don't get on your bus, and you don't get a bus because there's not enough people. They wouldn't get on it if you got the bus. Why? Because they only want to do one event themselves, because they have to go back to work and write about jumping cats that smile. That's the reality of it, and it does affect the election because it leaves basically partisan sources, my view. It leaves partisan sources, radical polarization, in their caves. No one wants to come out and see the middle ground. No one's motivated to do it. The media isn't motivated, except for a few circumstances. It's not a blanket indictment. But in New Jersey, it is a blanket indictment, I think, because we don't have TV, really, of our own nature to cover ourselves. You know, we have a TV market the size of Boston, and we really don't have a real TV station here. We got a cable thing, News 12, and we got NJTV. The audience numbers at 12 are real, especially in the morning, but they're not competitive. NJTV really doesn't have that much of an audience on here. Elites, it's good, and I think it's good in the absence of anything else as well, but it doesn't hit. When the 2 debates that were done in this gubernatorial campaign, right? If you take matching funds, you're obligated to take 2 public debates. Fine, that's good civic enterprise. Politicians laugh at that. They laugh at that because the commission that decides where they're going to do this, and there's no right choices because no one's going to watch the debate, and the stations themselves try to hide it. They don't promote it as much as they should, and they know the ratings are going to take a hit to do that. And it's a civic obligation to do it more than anything else. But it's only 2 debates. It's only 2 plus 1 for the lieutenant governor. That's outrageous. If you get the money, you should have a debate every week on here. Why doesn't the legislature change that? After a while, it will be watched. It will be watched. But 2 debates, and this year was one is in the middle of the Yankees run at the World Series. A bunch of nobody saw those debates. I'm telling you, nobody. And a front runner is happy with that, and the one running behind is horrified by that, because the one running behind can't make it a horse race and close 15 points. And the public is cheated by this as well. I thought the debates, both candidates did really well, but nobody saw it. But more people should see it more often, I think, and that would have an effect at eliminating or trying to eliminate this polarization, which is really horrible for the country and for New Jersey. And New Jersey is just basically unknown. We just don't know. And we're a bifurcated state, too, by the way, because we have South Jersey and North Jersey, and they don't intermingle. It's a crazy thing about this state, right? Not much has changed, even with TV, to Ben Franklin's phrase that New Jersey is a keg tapped at both ends. Same now, tapped by TV markets that are first and fourth and different from each other and don't cover each other. Any other questions? I guess we're good.
All right, let's have a round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you. Always good to get the inside scoop, and Jim always delivers it in a way that makes it interesting, and we always welcome. Thank you for your partnership, always, Jim. So as we wrap up today, I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank our sponsors once again. I want to thank the great BIA event staff for all the great work they did today. Give them a round of applause. And we actually have an event following this, if you can believe it, like the day wasn't full enough, but our Women Business Leaders Council is going to be meeting upstairs to do a quarterly meeting. If anyone would like to join us for that program, and we have a speaker joining us, please feel free to. So I want to finish up. As I said, I start positive, I end positive, and in between we have a lot of discussion and a lot of engagement. New Jersey's economy is very strong. Businesses are bullish on New Jersey. We go into the next year with cautious optimism. We're concerned in that we know there's a lot of uncertainty, and our goal is to bring some clarity. Oh, and Jim has something he wants to share with us because he just got a note. So let him share this, please.
Did you want to read it?
Oh, you can read it. It's fine. Thank you.
So the missing person because of the schedule was the governor himself, who wanted to do this. And it was away, and it was, as I'm told, because I was at transition yesterday, he wasn't there, he was in travel, and that it might not make today. And that was one of the original reasons. But he did send this letter here, which it's addressed to the organization and to you, Michelle. I apologize I cannot be with you today. Getting our state's economy working again for all New Jerseyans is my top priority, and I want New Jersey to be a place that is attractive to businesses of all types and all sizes. We all know our great advantages, our location and our highly educated workforce, buttressed by strong communities, public schools, and institutions of higher education. But I know we can and must do more. As I said during the campaign, reference to that campaign I told you about, I want to make it easier for businesses in New Jersey to succeed. I stand ready to work with NJBIA and with all of you to streamline processes and further cut red tape and to reduce the costs of health care, to name just 2 areas where I believe we can make progress quickly. I thank you for all your commitment to creating jobs and economic opportunity here in New Jersey, and for your optimism for the year ahead. As governor, you'll always find my door to be open and that you have a seat at my table.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Appreciate that very much. Thank you, Jim.
Yep.
All right, and that was from our governor-elect, so that was wonderful to end the day. So I wish you all happy holidays, a prosperous new year. We'll see you in 2018. We have much to do, and we look forward to having you along for the ride with us. Thank you.